Welcome to tonight's presentation with Stu Hilts, Botanic Gardens, Amsterdam, Paris, London, Isle of Wight, and Edinburgh. I'm Liz McCullum, a member of the Library's Arts and Culture Council. The council meets monthly to organize art exhibits and programs in the gallery. Our presenter for this program is Stu Hilts, a retired professor from the University of Guelph in the Faculty of Environmental Sciences. Two previous presentations by Stu were Waterfalls in the Beaver Valley and Wildflowers in our local area. Stu and his wife, Maria, have enjoyed travel. Often in their many trips have been garden visits, as both are keen gardeners. With Stu, we are now off to 5 significant European and British botanic gardens that they have visited. We may end in a local garden, seeing influence these larger ones have brought home. Welcome, Stu. I'll turn it over to you now.
Welcome to this presentation on some botanic gardens in Europe. These are gardens that my wife and I have all visited and really enjoyed. And as you can see, I'm sitting here in my dining room recording this, the magic of Zoom presentations, which I'm still not used to, but in any case, you may also be able to tell that I'm sitting in my wheelchair with a headrest behind me and a little yellow ball up on my left, my left, which is where my flag goes in the summer when I'm roaming the streets, which is the extent of my traveling now. But we're going to visit 6 botanic gardens in Europe, mostly England, and try and give you some understanding of the background and function of these botanic gardens, as well as looking at pretty pictures. I should say from the beginning, this is not a presentation about flowers. I'm not a botanist or a horticulturalist. This is more about garden design and the features and function of these gardens. So we're going to visit botanic gardens in Amsterdam, in Paris, 2 in London, 1 on the Isle of Wight. That's probably one you haven't heard of. And I'm saving Edinburgh to the last because Edinburgh was my favorite. Botanic gardens really started thousands of years ago. They started with the Neolithic Revolution, which is when we gave up hunting and gathering and gradually became agricultural. And in order to do that, people started saving seeds. And you begin to get the very, very early domestication of crops. If you picture early hunters and gatherers finding a particularly good patch of a plant that provided food, whether that was a plant that ultimately became a grain or berries, saving the seeds and scattering them and then getting more of a crop the following year. We don't know much about that, but we have interpreted that from our understanding of the Neolithic Revolution. And then as we go through time, there begin to be records of plant hunters, specifically sent out to hunt for interesting plants. Kings in Persia and Egypt sent plant hunters out to hunt for fruit trees, for example. Charlemagne, the emperor of what we would now consider France, issued an edict in the 8th century to grow particular herbs that were considered to be valuable for medicine. And then through the Dark Ages that we speak of, before the Renaissance, the monasteries were the places where the botanical knowledge was kept alive. Their gardens tended to be divided between vegetables, fruit trees, and medicinal plants. So we're still not talking flowers. These are plants that are useful for some reason. Black Death led to what we now call physic gardens. So if there's a specific origin of botanic gardens, it's the Black Death. It's quite ironic that, the Black Death is a very negative corner of human history, and yet botanic gardens are a very beautiful corner of the gardens we have today. The worst impact of the Black Death was in the mid-1300s, but it reappeared several times up into the late 1600s and was said to have killed 60% of the population in Europe. Makes COVID look like a picnic. With no doctors or nurses or hospitals in those days, so it was apothecaries who people turned to hoping for cures, and the apothecaries turned to plants. So medicinal plants from the physic gardens of monasteries were the starting point for those apothecaries. And governments began establishing botanic gardens to grow those medicinal plants. So botanic gardens are a direct outgrowth of the Black Death. Chelsea Physic Garden is the primary example in England, although it wasn't the very first. One of the big influences on the plants we have found, and we begin now to think of flowers as well, came through the Age of Discovery. So explorers headed out from Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, and England to conquer the world, essentially. It was very much an imperialistic episode in human history, ignoring the native people who lived in those new territories. And those early explorers sought particularly things like gold and land, but quickly realized that there were lots of fascinating new plants they were coming across. And so plant hunting became an important part of those expeditions. We gained new crops, so crops like potatoes, tomatoes, corn, coffee, etc., were not grown in Europe until the Age of Discovery brought them back. And botanic gardens began to play a big role in developing those crops from particular plants brought back by the explorers. And some of those were flowers. So we begin to have the flowers that we now grow. I'm not going to talk about European imperialism and colonialism and what we did to the rest of the world, but I do want to acknowledge that the Age of Discovery has a very negative side to it. Medicinal plants are where it started, and these botanic gardens did grow directly out of the Black Death. But with the Age of Discovery, it expanded well beyond medicinal plants and got into botany, an interest in all plants and learning how to classify those plants. So a great deal of botanical work and early botanic garden work was about the classification of all these fascinating new plants that had been found around the world. Often those early gardens were attached to universities, and in fact, Oxford was the first in the UK, which we have been to, but I lost those photos in our house fire. There's one development I want to mention before we start looking at the 6 botanical gardens, and this is the Wardian case. Dr. Ward in London invented this portable terrarium, and it takes various shapes, but this is an example. This meant that they could bring back live plants. Early explorers were bringing back seeds of plants, but often seeds did not germinate once they were moved to a new climate and didn't get the usual regime of temperatures that they lived through in their native habitat. So the Wardian case, as it was called, enabled the transport of live plants, and that dramatically increased the possibility of bringing plants back to these botanic gardens. So with that background information, let's turn to the gardens. I've organized these in order of age from Amsterdam through to the Isle of Wight. As I said, I'm saving Edinburgh for the last because it was my favorite. But let's start with Amsterdam. The Hortus Botanicus in Amsterdam was founded by the city council as the Hortus Medicus. So that specific attempt to find medically useful plants. It was intended like a herb garden for the city's doctors and apothecaries, which used herbs in the days before modern drugs. And the Black Death was raging again at this stage in Amsterdam, so they were rather desperate. It's on a very compact site in downtown Amsterdam, but certainly manages an amazing group of plants. This is the big greenhouse, tall enough to allow tropical trees to grow inside, and you can even see some trees there that have been moved outside during the summer months, the small palms. They not only have palms, but they have cycads. The one on the left is a cycad, which is an endangered group of plants, this one from South Africa. They've got a fascinating canopy walk, a treetop walk, but inside the greenhouse, which I found really interesting. And like many of these botanic gardens, they have a small collection of carnivorous plants, those ones on the left. One of the key functions of botanic gardens is to classify plants. So an interest in all the plant families and how we keep them separate and what the key identifying features are and so on became one of the core functions. These are the so-called systematic beds at the Amsterdam Botanic Garden, the Hortus Botanicus, where they grow representative members of different families of plants. It's widely used in education for botany students, of course, but it's also partly research. Much of the function of botanic gardens doing this sort of work is out of sight in the research labs and the research greenhouses, where scientists are sorting out botany even today. But these systematic beds reflect the public education about plant families. We didn't spend a lot of time in those because, as I've said, I'm not a horticulturalist. And once we visit these gardens, my wife and I often tend to go in opposite directions, me with my camera and her looking at the plants, since she is a horticulturalist. Those large lily pads that we will come back to, Victoria Amazonica, and in the lower right, the leaves of Gunnera, which always fascinated me. They look like rhubarb, but they're tall enough for you to stand under. A very mature, large ginkgo tree on the right, and a tree that I don't remember the name of on the left. I thought about swapping that picture on the left out for something I do have the information on, but it struck me as a good time to mention that if you're going to these botanic gardens and you're taking pictures like I do, you really should take some notes of plant labels along the way, or take a second picture of the plant label at the time so that you can later know what it is. That's one of my 2 hints for you about visiting botanic gardens. Now we go to the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. These are the systematic beds there, and in the far distance is one of the museums attached to this garden. The Jardin des Plantes was founded as a Jardin Royal des Plantes Médicinales, So again, we're dealing initially with those medically useful plants. But I have read since we came home that this garden is really a group of museums as well as the garden, all under what they call the National Museum of Natural History. So it includes galleries of evolution and mineralogy and a mineral collection and so on, some of which is research oriented and not open to the public. It struck me as being like the Royal Ontario Museum with a garden attached. There is a zoo, or what they call a menagerie, which started when they rescued the animals from Versailles during the French Revolution. A school of botany, the world's largest herbarium. So it's a pretty big, interesting garden. Unfortunately, we didn't read very much about this before we went. These are the systematic beds that I'm walking you through here again. We were in Paris to see two other gardens, Versailles and Giverny, probably the two most popular gardens in France. And we had been to a gallery in the morning and we had 3 hours to kill. So I looked at the map and said, oh, there's a botanic garden over in this corner of Paris. Let's go see that. So we went with no background and hadn't read about it before we went. They even have some aquatic beds out in this corner of the garden. One of the corners I usually like to go to is the rock garden. In this case, the rock garden is quite different, a small area focusing on significant little piles of boulders. And in this case, those are almost all different ferns. And ferns are one of my favorite. So I enjoyed that. Here, a closer look, you may be able to recognize in the lower left and the upper right, the hart's tongue fern. This looked like the green giant had vomited. It's actually a sandwort. A very, very unusual plant because it didn't have what to me were visible separate leaves. It's like a completely densely packed surface of green spongy material, except it's not spongy. They are able to have a little bit of different habitats. So this is a bit of a desert habitat, but of course the climate of Paris doesn't do well for deserts. This illustrates another important point. Botanic gardens are always changing, developing new corners of the garden. This is a new rock garden being developed at this garden in Paris. And while I'm thinking of it, the Royal Botanical Garden we'll get to in Edinburgh is now developing a series of community gardens where people can get a garden plot. And that's a new development there in the last 10 years or so. So my advice after visiting this garden is to read a bit about gardens before you go, if you can, so that you know what you're seeing and you don't come away disappointed later because you didn't see particular features. That's my second hint for visiting botanic gardens. And now we're back to England. The Chelsea Physic Garden is the first garden I want to touch on. Again, the very word physic refers to healing or medicinal plants. And this was established by the famous Society of Worshipful Apothecaries, for training apprentices way back in the 1600s. It was the world's most richly stocked botanic garden in the mid-1700s. That was when all those English explorers were roaming the world and bringing back interesting plants. Its seed exchange has been running since 1688. But it's pretty small now. Some of it has been lost to development, and it's a tiny little parcel of land in London. But those medicinal plants are still there, and they're very well organized into not systematic beds representing all plants, but systematic beds representing the medicinal plants. So you can walk back and forth between these beds of plants and see plants that are useful for particular medical uses. Here's a group that were useful for anesthesia and analgesia. Some of this is historic, and drugs have been developed, so they're not using the plants directly anymore. Some of it is research still ongoing. Again, there's a little collection of carnivorous plants. This includes the pitcher plant that's common in the Bruce Peninsula of Ontario, as well as some from other parts of the world. One of the big displays currently at the Chelsea Physic Garden is garlic. So this is an example of information that's provided to the visitor, as well as beds of garlic. And this is another function of botanic gardens compared to the other gardens you might visit. Botanic gardens usually have lots of information about the plants you're seeing, and they always have plant labels. That is certainly not the case in many gardens that you might visit, even though they may be quite beautiful. So botanic gardens serve to provide more information for the visitor. This is the big garlic display, including a frame that they're trying to grow garlic on to look the shape of a garlic bulb. And now we get to the big garden, the big botanic garden, one of the biggest in the world, Kew Gardens in the southwest corner of London. There are several different entrances to Kew Gardens, but the one we came in through was quite close to the Palm House, the original big tropical greenhouse, and all kinds of interesting tropical plants inside. You could spend an entire day just visiting 2 greenhouses at Kew. They're absolutely amazing. Let me tell you a bit about the history of Kew Gardens, besides the fact it's the largest in the world. It was started by Augusta, who was the Dowager Princess of Wales and was living in Kew Palace at the time. Part of the Kew Palace building still stands at the east end of the garden. But her husband, Frederick, died before he could become king. Fred was the Prince of Wales back in the 1700s. And after he had died, she started getting interested in the garden, or she needed something to keep herself occupied. So they started with a physic garden of medicinal plants again. All of these botanic gardens go back to an original starting point of medicinal plants. Soon after, she got involved in laying out the entire garden. She didn't design, but worked with architects to design the several buildings, some of which still stand, like the Orangery and the Pagoda. But Fred, unfortunately, who was the son of George II, died before his father, so he never became king. And it's said that he died after he caught a chill gardening with his team of gardeners in the rain. So he's the only future king to die from excessive devotion to gardening. But he never became king. We never had a King Fred, even though, because he was the eldest son, his children succeeded in the sequence of succession. Today, Kew Gardens has 7 major greenhouses, several ornamental buildings, a treetop walk, and my favorite, the person-scale badger set. It has the biggest botanical and mycological collection in the world. It has one of the largest herbariums in the world. It occupies 330 acres in southwest London. It has 14,000 trees. You can't easily even walk through the entire Kew Gardens in a day. And if you did, you'd be exhausted. It grew the first rubber trees, which are one of the interesting success stories. They sent someone to gather seeds of rubber trees in Brazil. They developed those and sent them to Asia and revolutionized the rubber trade. The rubber tree crop, the crop of rubber, was grown primarily in Asia, even though the trees were not native to Asia. So the work of Kew Gardens reflects the emergence of modern botany, including both economic and forensic botany, as well as those medicinal plants. So here's some interesting pictures of Kew Gardens. There's my lovely wife, Maria, who knows all the plants, standing outside the water lily garden. So inside this small greenhouse is the collection of giant water lilies from the Amazon. Named after Queen Victoria, Victoria Amazonica. It is said that these water lilies can grow to 10 feet across, and a small child could stand on them without sinking. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but these were 3 to 4 feet across. Quite a remarkable size of water lily. Further to the southeast in Kew Garden are the systematic beds. So like other botanic gardens, Kew has a range of beds that illustrate plant families. And this is heavily used for education in Kew. We saw a group of students there working on 2 or 3 of the particular beds, learning about the different plant families. Quite a large area devoted to this. And down the middle is this stunning walkway, like a pergola, and there's my good wife again. All of those flowers down the walkway are roses. Here's 2 of the modern greenhouses. On the left, the curved one is the Alpine greenhouse, and on the right is the Princess of Wales Conservancy. The Alpine greenhouse is really unusual. It has, as you'd expect, a lot of rock-loving plants that grow in the high alpine areas. And besides having the right substrate, the rocks for them to grow in, they have to keep this greenhouse cool because it's cool climate at high altitudes. So those 2 curved silver pipes in the background are blowing in cool air. As you can imagine, a greenhouse out in the sun would tend to get warm in the summer. They have to air condition this greenhouse. The Princess of Wales Conservancy houses a number of separate displays representing different climate zones around the world. It's a modern greenhouse built into the ground, so it's energy efficient. And the trick question here is which Princess of Wales this conservancy was named after. It was opened by Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales, when she opened it. Inside, we didn't see the entire greenhouse, but there's a desert room with a wonderful collection of cacti. There's a high alpine desert garden that features these lithops. They look like stones to me, and they are referred to as living stones. Very unusual little plants that survive in the very high alpine areas. And again, carnivorous plants. Carnivorous plants seem to be popular, although they're small collections. On the left, you have the Venus flytrap, and on the right, the linear leaf sundew. You can see plenty of the linear leaf sundew up the Bruce Peninsula, like those pitcher plants. The other big greenhouse is working toward the opposite end of Kew, the western end. This is the temperate house. This is a very large greenhouse with separate sections, not to house the really tropical plants, which are in the palm house, but the frost-sensitive plants of the southern temperate areas, like parts of the Caribbean and southern US. This greenhouse architecturally is fascinating to me That's a walkway around the upper level where you can look down on the canopy. This greenhouse was totally refurbished a few years ago after we have been there. So these pictures are before the refurbishment, and is now open to the public again. And so I'm not sure actually how much this greenhouse has changed, but it's full of those unusual frost sensitive plants, including a group of tree ferns. In the southwest corner of Kew is the pagoda, one of Princess Augusta's buildings back from the mid 1700s. And I believe you can climb up the various levels of this, but it was closed when we were there. You'll notice just to the upper left of the pagoda, a plane. Unfortunately, Kew is on the approach track for Heathrow, so you're hearing a plane overhead approximately every minute apart. Behind the pagoda and working your way north now is a beautiful walkway through the more forested part of Kew Gardens. It's not a forest, but it's all the planted trees, many of which are quite mature at this stage because they were planted in the 17 or 1800s. Redwoods and sequoias among them. And it's just a beautiful walk for a distance up that corner of the gardens, which are not so intensively developed as the southeast corner where all the educational work takes place. That's actually me standing at the base of that sequoia, I believe it is. There were peacocks wandering around and being very friendly. The color pattern was just amazing. In 1987, a major storm went through southern England, the storm of the century, so to speak. And Kew, like many other places, lost hundreds of trees, big old trees. But some smart sparks in the arborist crew that was brought in to cut down the trees that had fallen over and tidy things up, decided to save some logs and created an amazing playground for kids or for adults like me. This is a line of logs with steps cut and bridges from one log to the next that extends around quite a long distance. You're only seeing about a quarter of it here. And I walked the entire thing. It was great fun. And guess what comes next after the log walk? The badger set. Badgers are, of course, an interesting rural animal in England. We don't have them here. But badgers are a little bit like groundhogs in building a burrow underground, but badgers will build it up bigger and more extensively than your typical groundhog. So they have created a series of tunnels under a mound, obviously built carefully enough that these tunnels would not collapse on a little kid exploring them. They have a wooden badger in one corner. And then, yes, you get even adults like myself who may have to stoop to go through the tunnels, but I found it to be great fun. I went through and turned around and came back through and the other direction, and Maria had to drag me away from the badger set. They also have a treetop walk, which is quite amazing, but I didn't find it as interesting as the badger set. They have a beautiful curved bridge over the ornamental lake in the northwest corner of the park, the garden, known as the Sackler Crossing, donated by the Sackler family of America. This illustrates one of the fundraising dilemmas that all of these gardens and other charities, lots of other charities, get into, because the Sackler family is the family that owns Purdue Pharma. who produced OxyContin and contributed enormously to the epidemic of drug use, opioid drug use across America. So now there's a move to take the Sackler family's name off various places where they've donated the money. No easy solution to that sort of ethical dilemma, but it's one of the things that gardens may find themselves facing because they are such public places. This is the rhododendron walk and the roses on the arbor on the left. You can walk for a couple of 100 yards through rhododendrons, and they were all in bloom when we were there the last time. We've been there twice. And this is the Great Broad Walk, which has been in place for a long time, but they planted borders, curving flower borders down this walk in 2016. So that has been since we visited, so we haven't seen this. So that's one of my few pictures that is not my own. This is also not my own picture. The hive, a phantasmagorical creation that is intended to look like a honeybee hive, which you can walk into and look around. And that's the end of visiting Kew Gardens. While we're still in England, I'd like to take you to visit the Ventnor Botanic Garden on the Isle of Wight. This is a much, much more recent botanic garden, not established for medicinal plants, but for Mediterranean plants. The Isle of Wight, one of the southernmost corners of England, of course, has a steep south-facing slope where there are cliffs and terraces and more cliffs and more terraces tumbling down to the English Channel. But because that slope faces south and is on an angle, it has microclimate of Mediterranean temperatures. It was first used as a tuberculosis sanitarium, actually, and today it has the unrivaled collection of subtropical plants in the UK that are growing outside. So it was established privately, but is now run by what we call an NGO. They call a CIC, Community Interest Corporation. And it has plants like the bottlebrush plant from South Africa and a number of other interesting Mediterranean plants. Quite an amazing garden to have been established by a private individual. It has one of the few places I've seen fig trees that would ripen completely on their own. My relatives always tried to grow fig trees in southern Ontario and had to take them inside during the winter. A beautiful hydrangea corner of the garden. And then it has the giant viper's bugloss. This plant stood out and was so unusual compared to any plant we'd ever seen in this garden. That's one of the reasons for including it here today. The giant viper's bugloss, or Echium pinninana, can be 10 feet high, a huge column of tiny, tiny little flowers. That's just a plant unlike anything I've ever seen elsewhere. You may be familiar with the viper's bugloss here, a small weed that grows in midsummer, bright blue flowers, but you might find it along the roadside in the gravel. No comparison to the giant viper's bugloss. And finally, we move on to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. This is the eastern gate that we were going in. This is a long time ago now. A few background facts. It was founded quite early, again, to grow those medicinal plants. It's been moved in locations, but now has a site occupying 70 acres and plays a very big role internationally on the conservation of biodiversity. That's a side of all these botanic gardens, the research side that goes on behind the scenes that you don't learn as much about by just visiting the garden. It has a number of special collections, the Alpine Garden, the Cryptogamic Garden, the Rock Garden, and the Palms in the Palm House. We will be looking at the Rock Garden and the Alpine Garden particularly. It's another world-leading herbarium. And locally, if you live in Edinburgh, it's a very popular place to simply go for a walk. As well, as I said, one of the new things they've developed is a group of community gardens. So on the, I believe it's the north side of the park, the garden, they had some space that was not being effectively used, and they laid it out to allow people to have garden plots. A very typical thing to have in England and Scotland, but not typical in a botanic garden. So that's a new development. This is the Palm House, the original Palm House, some of the more modern greenhouses that are attached to it today, showing up on the lower right. And inside, you find more of those giant water lilies, the Victoria Amazonica, and lots of tree ferns and tropical flowers. It's really quite an amazing tropical garden to walk through inside the Palm House. But the part we spent the most time in was the Rock Garden and the Alpine Garden. This is the Rock Garden, which is over on the east side of this garden. And there were lots of shrubs, some in flower. And as you can see, this is a very mature rock garden. Most of these shrubs have got quite large now. And although you can walk between them, it's not little new shrubs being established. That's my good wife again, Maria, in the distance under the umbrella. A little bit of rain doesn't stop us exploring botanic gardens. One of the things I've mentioned before is the information you gain from visiting a botanic garden compared to the average garden. We have been to lots of gardens in England and Scotland particularly, and several more in Europe. And you don't even get plant labels in many of those gardens. So the very regular plant labels on everything are one of the advantages of visiting a botanic garden, a place you can learn some of that. There's a beautiful walk through the trees. Again, these trees were often planted in the 17 or 1800s, so they're quite mature today. Even trees like the spruce from out in Western North America, as well as the sequoia and redwoods, have been planted here and are now quite mature. This is the unusual monkey puzzle tree, which is native to high alpine areas in Chile. And this is a tulip tree. This is the only tulip tree I have seen where the tulip blooms were low enough on the tree for me to get a picture. The tulip trees are pretty rare this far north in Ontario. They dominate the forest down around the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. So tulips can be a big component of forests south of us. On the Guelph campus, there was an enormous tulip tree. And we have one in our front yard. There's a fairly mature one on Collingwood Street in Meaford. But I had to go to Scotland to get a picture of the tulip tree flower. So here it is. Let me stop at this point and mention some of the benefits of botanical gardens before we conclude. Medical discoveries, of course, especially in the early years, have been an important part of botanical gardens. The economic benefits, wild plants that have been developed into important economic crops. Flowers, lots of our current flowers have been grown and developed initially in botanic gardens, although the commercialization occurs usually in commercial nurseries. And for visitors, there are all those health benefits of having a nice walk in the park. And finally, you get ideas from these gardens. You get ideas from all the gardens, but I got the most direct ideas from the botanical garden, particularly the Alpine Garden in Edinburgh. So let me conclude by giving you that very personal example. This is the Alpine Garden in a corner of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. Many of the alpine plants, some are in that little greenhouse. Others are in troughs, stone troughs outside. The plants generally are tiny, the type that would survive in an alpine environment. And I have to tell you, I was just absolutely fascinated with these tiny gardens, in effect. A stone trough, this one is probably 1.5 feet wide by 3 feet long. And inside that space, you have this tiny little garden of alpine plants. Now, I should say, at the stage we were visiting Edinburgh for the first time, we had moved up here to the Beaver Valley and lived on a country property down near the Beaver Valley Ski Club. And we're trying to landscape our property to have some gardens. And yours truly was the undergardener who did most of the work. And I took these ideas from the Alpine Garden in Edinburgh home to our own garden. Of course, Maria helped with the plant selection for here in Southern Ontario. But we had this eroding, weedy slope, 4 feet long, that was fairly steep. And I had to figure out how to deal with that. There's already a wall at the bottom of it, nearly 3 feet high, and I didn't want to have a taller wall. So I sprayed down the grass that was growing on this slope. I dug out all the grass roots. If you keep your eye on that higher rock on the upper right-hand corner, it may help you with these following pictures. I dug little rocks into that slope to create, in effect, tiny terraces, covered the whole thing with mulch to try and control the weeds for the beginning. And then we started planting the alpine type of plants that we could get here. You can see that tall rock in the upper right still. These were tiny little plants that to me are still the most fascinating plants in the garden. And eventually that entire slope was transformed into an alpine garden, or what you would call a scree garden. If you look at this, you can see that the mulch we eventually used on the surface consisted of fine gravel, what they call 1/4-inch chip. Fine gravel on the surface, which replicated the alpine environment. And it strung out about 30 feet long and 5 to 6 feet wide. That was my favorite part of the garden as far as the plants went. Maria's favorite part was probably the hosta collection, which I haven't shown you. And then there were all the unique, incredibly unique little plants that look like a cluster of leaves on the ground most of the year, and then suddenly send up a shoot with some unusual flowers on the top. And I could still enjoy that type of alpine or scree garden. And that brings us to the end. So I believe if you have questions about this, you're welcome to submit them to the Thornbury Library, and I would attempt to provide answers by email. So thank you very much. and I hope you've learned a little bit about botanic gardens.
Thank you, Stu. You have taken us to 5 very special, well-chosen gardens, which I feel many may be not as familiar to us. Your perspective and approach has given us a deeper look and understanding of the gardens. Your special eye with the camera has captured many features. You have inspired us also to include gardens in our trips. As we sit here surrounded by snow and white conditions, you have given us a break and reminded us that there will be green and vegetation out there when spring decides to approach. Thank you again, Stu, for your effort and time you have taken to prepare this presentation and to share it with our viewers. We really appreciate it. You're coming back a third time. And to our viewers, on Thursday, March the 31st, Mike Arkless is taking us to Prague, Budapest, and Vienna. The new show, March show, has been hung at the library, Color Frees the Soul. I'd like to mention also that we really appreciate the many artists, over 60 of them, that contributed to the February Purple Show. Thanks to everyone who has joined us tonight.